Every fighter needs a cause. Every cause needs a fighter. The Sumud Podcast is sponsored by The Karate Attorney, fighting for justice inside and outside the courtroom. Visit karateattorney.com or follow on Instagram at karateattorney to learn more.
The legal by itself isn't going to make the difference. Where there is organizing, there are so many opportunities to achieve results. And that organizing is part and parcel of our fundamental organizing against genocide. This is a movement for freedom, for justice. Despite the way that our opposition paints us, we have to stand firm in our moral and ethical motivations here.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
Visit sumudpod.com to subscribe and connect with us on social media. You can also support our work by contributing monthly on the Support Us page. Even $10 a month helps us continue amplifying Palestinian voices and those in solidarity. Thank you.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Dima Khalidi. Dima is the founder and director of Palestine Legal, the only U.S. group solely devoted to protecting the rights of people who speak out for Palestinian freedom. She protects students, educators, and activists from repression, carrying her family's legacy of resistance and turning justice into her life's calling. Welcome to the podcast, Dima.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
So I got to tell you, this interview is 100% about you. I want to be very clear in the great work that you're doing with Pal Legal. But I got to say, I would be remiss not to bring up your family, just generally speaking. So any Palestinian listening to this podcast, I don't care where they're listening, they're going to geek out over the list I'm about to go over. Are you okay with me going over your family tree really quick?
If you insist, you know.
So El-Sheikh Numan El-Khalidi El-Azri, 19th century religious scholar. He's your great-great-great-grandfather. El-Hajj Rahib El-Khalidi, judge, founder of Khalidi Library. Just to be clear, he's your great-great-grandfather. Ismail El-Khalidi, UN political affairs officer, your grandfather. Rashid Khalidi, historian, Columbia professor, he's your father. Yusuf Dia El-Khalidi, mayor of Jerusalem, Ottoman statesman, and he's the one who corresponded with Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism. And then Walid Khalidi, historian, co-founder of Institute for Palestine Studies. He's your first cousin once removed. And as you know, cousin is a cousin. We're all cousins here, so I don't know why they put in once removed. So he's your cousin. And then there's you, the founder of Palestine Legal. Does this carry a certain weight or pressure to have this lineage, or is this the source of strength for your fight?
Certainly, I've grown up understanding the legacy of various members of my family. They have always been really part of the Palestinian story, as all of our families are, right? We all have, as Palestinians, the stories of the Palestinian struggle in our own families. I don't want to elevate my family above others. Certainly, they had titles and positions that make them maybe eligible for the history books, but they were, as much as anyone, really part of the struggle for Palestinian nationalism, for Arab nationalism, against Zionism in its early stages. A lot of my ancestors were exiled, whether by the British or the Ottomans before that. I think there is strength that I draw from that. And it's not just on the Khalidi side. On my mother's side, her grandfather was Isa al-Isa, who started the newspaper Al-Palestine. And that was a primary place where, Zionism was being debated and really exposed for what it was trying to do in the early 1900s. I think that strength comes, yes, from the history of my family, but also from the history of all of the struggle that our people has been through over the last 100 and more years, right? And just as important were the people who were on the front lines, right, during the 36 to 39 revolt. And a lot of that was happening on other levels of society as well. So yes, I draw strength from it and humility as well. It's also for me a responsibility, right? We don't have the luxury to sit back and watch as our people are being decimated. We don't have the luxury to twiddle our thumbs and our pens. And it is such a critical moment in our people's history. Maybe the most critical, obviously, 1948 is kind of the moment that we all look to when we lost our land. But I think this is just such a crucial, pivotal moment. It's really up to us to make sure that the tens and probably hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives being lost right now in Gaza and throughout Palestine are not in vain. And that is a heavy responsibility, but I think all of us are feeling that right now.
Yeah. And I completely understand and respect the humility you're bringing to the table with regards to your family. But I'm going to say this on your behalf because I was kind of laughing as I was going through your history. You are literally a Zionist worst nightmare. How do we get rid of the Khalidi family? What do we got to do here to get them off of our backs? And here you are, you're on the front lines right now in America, in the US, fighting for us. That's just a powerful thing to be witnessing, just to be honest with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I certainly don't think of myself in that way. I think this generation of Palestinians, Palestinian Americans, have the power to see change in our lifetimes, I hope. As desperate as it feels right now, I think it's so clear that the tide is shifting, and that's partly because of this generation of Palestinians who are really in the different arenas, right? And understand this system in the US and are contesting within those arenas. And I think Palestine Legal certainly is something that I founded, I started, but its importance, its relevance, its impact is really from the people who work with me in the organization, who are really on the front lines as well, taking the calls every day from students and other activists who are facing a huge amount of repression right now and have been over the last decade plus, right? This isn't new, what we're seeing, but it is on a larger scale than we've ever seen before. And the other thing that we're seeing is that so many, not just Palestinians, but lawyers from across the country and from every background are also stepping up in this moment. And that's one of our roles right now, is to help organize lawyers and the legal profession and people who really see the importance of this moment and how crucial this repression against the Palestine movement is in the broader struggle against fascism, frankly, right? I think we are many who are really throwing down right now.
I could appreciate that. So that sense of history clearly shaped your own path as a lawyer. You were already in the fight even before fighting for the creation or starting even Palestine Legal. Some of the cases early on, the Mohammed Salah case in 2007, the Palestinian American accused of terrorism. You were an intern on the defense team, if I'm not mistaken. The Mamila Cemetery campaign, the Israelis plan to build on a historic Muslim cemetery. You were co-counsel with CCR. And then as a CCR Ella Baker intern, you worked directly on holding Israel accountable to international laws and supported detainees that were at Guantanamo Bay. How did those early experiences shape the lawyer and advocate you've become?
I appreciate that question because I think those experiences were really formative for me. I went to law school thinking that I would study international law and that that was a primary avenue to fight for Palestinian rights, and grew pretty quickly disillusioned with that. And I think that's playing out today, even more so. The places that I interned during law school really helped to shape the way that I viewed the role of lawyers as not just, meant to be in courts and fight for their clients, but really as movement lawyers, as people who have access to the legal world, but are really connected to and committed to advancing the goals of a movement. And in this case, we're talking about the Palestine movement. I saw that in action, right? I think the Mohammed Salah case was, for me, really eye-opening. I always questioned this kind of view of the law as some objective, neutral thing, right? And I think the Mohammed Salah case really blew that open. This was a Palestinian in the US who was really involved in his community. He went to Palestine, took humanitarian aid with him, was imprisoned and tortured by the Israelis, was tortured into signing a confession, eventually released, came back to the US, and then was essentially surveilled. They put an informant on him. And his was one of the first indictments, prosecutions after 9/11. And so they painted him as some terrorist mastermind. The way that the trial unfolded, the extent to which Israel was involved, they had Shin Bet agents testifying in court under pseudonyms and in disguise, right? They tried to have a lot of secret evidence. There were numerous ways that the prosecution subverted basic constitutional rights. And I think the way that I saw the defense attorneys handle the case was really an example for me of how we can engage in the practice of law while challenging these injustices. And Michael Deutsch was the lead defense attorney there. And, I think he used the courtroom in a way that put Israel on trial, that really focused on what Mohammed Salah went through, the torture, et cetera, but also what the Palestinian struggle is about. He also represented Rasmi Aude several years later. And it was the same thing, right? How do you, in a case that is really about political persecution, how do you bring in the story of someone who is being targeted because of who she is when the odds are stacked against you, when everything is being structured in a way to prevent that from happening? Again, the torture that she experienced, her own story of exile after 1948 from Lifta. So I think those experiences did really give me a real picture of what it could mean to lawyer in a way that really uplifts the stories that are being repressed, right? That are being silenced. I think a lot of those experiences gave me the kind of perspective that helped shape the way that we have built up Palestine Legal as well. The Memela Cemetery case was something that's close to me in the sense that I have ancestors buried in that ancient cemetery in West Jerusalem, as do many Palestinians. It's said to go back to the time of the Prophet. That case was really bringing this issue to the international arena. We filed a complaint with the Human Rights Commission and got a statement saying that this is against international law, that this is a desecration of cultural rights. It reinforced the kind of bankruptcy of the international legal system because they could ultimately do nothing about it other than make some statements, right? Yeah. And that's what we see happening today with a full-blown genocide happening, that there is no action. There may be some milquetoast words. But I think that was an example of the way that we can't just rely on legal processes to advance what we're trying to achieve. It has to be combined with organizing. It has to be combined with a communications plan that is really exposing what's happening in the media and beyond. You have to mobilize people. And that was an opportunity where a lot of Palestinian families whose ancestors were buried in that cemetery banded together and created a coalition along with organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights and others. So that was an important experience for me as well. And of course, the Museum of Tolerance was ultimately built on top of the cemetery. They literally dug out bones of people, and they had already built a park on part of the cemetery, right? So this desecration has been going on for many decades already. But it's the irony of building a Museum of Tolerance on top of an ancient cemetery that still makes the blood boil today.
It makes me sick, to be honest with you. It just makes me sick.
And it's, again, a story that you can repeat over and over in our history of occupation and dispossession, right? There are many cemeteries throughout Palestine that have been dug up, desecrated, built upon. Those are stories that we have to keep alive as well. As we see the complete destruction of our cultural heritage, we have to find ways to keep that history alive and to make sure that ultimately, inshallah, one day, there will be accountability, right?
Inshallah, yeah. I want to go back really quick to the Mohammed Salah case because it just reminded me of the Holy Land Foundation 5. I think you've commented on that matter before, but how aware are you of it, where it is now, and any of the challenges that they're facing, releasing, I think, the last 2 individuals?
Yeah, I mean, the Holy Land case is, I think, one of the most monumental cases in our recent experience as Palestinians in the US. I think it is a really clear example of the travesty of justice that happened to these men who were involved in humanitarian aid in Palestine and were again caught up in the post 9/11 frenzy to prosecute so-called terrorists. But these people were sending money to zakat committees, the same places where the US government was sending money even, right? I think the lessons of that trial really expose the extent to which the use of the anti-terrorism laws really justified the complete erosion of civil rights and liberties. Everything that we think of in the legal system, that is suspended when it comes to so-called terrorism prosecutions or cases. One thing that we've really been working on and focused on is exposing the way that this entire anti-terrorism regime, the legal regime of laws and executive orders and cases, has been built on anti-Palestinian racism and the targeting of Palestinian resistance in the Palestine movement, to the point to which, today we're seeing this very regime as the foundation for the targeting of not just Palestine groups, but, entire movements and social justice organizations, right? So I think it's a really clear lesson in terms of how these legal regimes are used and built and developed and evolve in order to, slowly but surely chip away at our fundamental rights. So, we can talk more about that, but I think it's a really crucial moment to understand that history of the evolution of these laws and these kinds of prosecutions in order to understand where we are and how these laws are being weaponized against all of our movements right now. The Trump administration is talking about and has designated a number of Palestinian groups as well as others and is threatening more such designations and revoking tax status of organizations and things like that. And this is all built upon this legal regime that allows a huge amount of executive discretion and very little due process in terms of challenging these things, whether it's a designation or otherwise.
In another interview, you'd mentioned Lawfare as being a primary tool now that's being used against us as well.
Yeah, I mean, lawfare in terms of the way that legal process is being used, litigation is being initiated in order to mire the movement groups, individual activists in, years and years of litigation, right? One of those tools for Zionist lawfare right now is part of this evolution that I talked about of anti-terrorism laws. And in the early 90s, a law was passed that gives individual civilians the right to bring a lawsuit against other individuals or groups or states or companies for harm allegedly from terrorist acts, right? Since before October 7th, certainly we were seeing an increase in these kinds of lawsuits, anti-terrorism act lawsuits. And one was against the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights in relation to the Great March of Return. And they essentially tried to say that this huge U.S.-based advocacy group was responsible or liable for paying money damages for burning forests from kites and balloons that were, released from Gaza. So it's this ridiculous attempt to create a causal connection between the alleged acts of groups that are designated as terrorist in Palestine to an advocacy group that tweeted some things. And that case failed, right? That case was dismissed both at the district level and at the appellate level. Since October 7th, we've seen at least 9 similar cases trying to hold, again, U.S. groups and individuals liable for Hamas's actions on October 7th. And these are sprawling cases. They name multiple defendants, often the biggest advocacy groups in the United States, as well as individual activists. It's a ridiculous attempt to try to say that Palestine advocacy groups here are responsible for October 7th. And a couple of those recently have also been dismissed, right? It's taken over a year in some cases, and they will likely be appealed. And that means it might take another couple of years to finally resolve these cases. And that's part of the strategy of lawfare. The process is the punishment, right? Yeah. The fact that you can't ignore these lawsuits, you have to defend against these lawsuits. And that takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of time. And it is chilling, right? It is chilling for the groups and individuals who are targeted. But I think so far, we're seeing dismissals of these really frivolous cases, and that is encouraging. And I think we can only expect more of these, really. And that's something that we're really focused on, is how we build up the ability to defend against these cases in ways that don't tax the movement, right? And really build up the legal precedent to make bringing these kinds of cases harder and harder.
Well, that's why Palestine Legal is so important. Just going back to 2012, that is when you started Palestine Legal, if I'm not mistaken. I know it was under a different name, but I like Palestine Legal. Nice, short and clear. But is this still the first and only U.S. nonprofit dedicated to Palestinian rights advocacy, legally speaking?
That's a good question, because we are seeing a lot of initiatives these days, certainly since the genocide and with the enormous need for legal support. But we are still the only legal organization that's exclusively working to defend and protect the movement. There are other initiatives that are coming up, and I think we'll be seeing more and more of that. And that's so incredibly important and needed. I think Pal Legal plays the role of being a first line of defense in a lot of ways. We are there so that people have somewhere to turn when they're being targeted. And certainly we're not the only organization that has played a really crucial role, especially since October 7th and the kind of ballooning of the need. CARE chapters are doing a lot of legal work in defense. The Center for Constitutional Rights is playing a really big role. Organizations like CUNY Clear are playing a critical role in defending folks and representing folks. So that's not to say that we're the only organization doing this kind of work, ADC also. But in terms of our mission being entirely dedicated to supporting this movement. Yeah, I think that's still the case.
Yeah. Can you just, for the audience, because the work that you all are doing is so powerful, and I want to encourage everybody to visit the Legal website, sign up, contribute. Again, it's important work, but could you just sort of restate the mission and the gap that you're attempting to close within Palestinian rights in the U.S.?
Yeah, we really exist to represent, defend, protect people who are speaking out for Palestinian rights against the increasing repression that we're seeing. And that is in order to really break the chilling effect that this kind of repression has, to make sure that it doesn't lead people to be intimidated into silence and inaction. And because that is really the intent of the repression, whether it's what we've been doing over the last 10, 13 years, or what we're seeing now, with the advent of the second Trump administration and an all-out assault on not just this movement, but all civil society, all social justice movements. Really, the gap that we saw and have tried to fill is what I mentioned in terms of a kind of first line of defense, right? But also recognizing from, 2012, when we started the organization, recognizing the kind of progression of lawfare strategies against the movement. How do we make sure that people who are engaging in boycott campaigns, for example, or who are speaking out on their campuses aren't bullied into silence? And at the time, we were seeing more lawsuits. We were seeing more crackdowns by universities. We were seeing the advent of a strategy to use anti-discrimination law to target Palestine activism on campuses. And that has been now the crux of the Trump administration's attack on universities, using Title VI, using anti-discrimination law to say, we can defund you because you're allowing a hostile anti-Semitic environment. So we really were, from the beginning, working to push back and challenge these efforts to shut down, to make it more difficult to organize. And that has been our work ever since, certainly.
And you've been doing a great job. I wanted to thank you for taking care of Serene Haddad from VCU. Amazing. You were able to get her degree back. She was on the podcast a few weeks ago.
Yeah, Serene Haddad is, an example of a student who has been just so brave and courageous in speaking out. Her own family is from Gaza. She has experienced such extreme loss. Her family has. And, I think she's really an example of what the student movement has achieved and been able to do in the face of so many odds over the last 2 years. They are really standing up against the tide of repression and understand that, it is not an option to be silent right now as our people are being annihilated. I think it's also an example of the way that universities have been acting over the last 2 years, really. But we saw the buildup pre-2023. I think all of our work pre-2023 shows that it was a lead up to this moment, to, the way that they reacted to student activism against the genocide. It is a very clear anti-Palestinian animus, very clear examples of anti-Palestinian discrimination. Pre-2023, we brought 3 discrimination complaints against universities for their anti-Palestinian discrimination. And after 2023, we brought 10 such complaints to the Department of Education. And, what we're seeing both on the university level and on the government level is a complete ignorance. They've completely ignored the impact on Palestinian and associated and allied students, not only of the genocide, but of the repression that they're facing, the doxing, the impact of the harassment that they're facing, the way that universities are changing policies and processes in order to punish them for their speech activities, the way that these excessive punishments are impacting disproportionately Palestinian Arab Muslim students and their allies, including many anti-Zionist Jewish students. So these are all things that came to play in Sidine's case. She managed to beat the punishment and attempt to take away her degree through an appeals process. But, the fact that that even happened is a real travesty. And it's happening to so many students. The excessiveness of the punishments that they're facing for supposedly violating these increasingly restrictive rules, right, that make a laughingstock of the notion of free speech on campuses or academic freedom. That's what's happening on campuses, is this, strangulation of free speech, of academic freedom for professors, right? This did not happen in a vacuum. The bricks were laid over many, many years towards this moment where universities and the government itself have been able to kind of pull the rug out from under student organizing.
Well, look, I actually think you tried to warn folks back in 2015. You released a landmark report that at that time, for an 18-month period, there were 300 incidents of suppression that were documented. 85% that were targeted were students and faculty, and it was across 65 plus campuses. And at that time, the main tactics used was events cancellation, administrative discipline, firings, false accusations of anti-Semitism. Did we not take your warning? I don't know. This is my labeling. I feel like you were warning us that this is going to get bad. But do you think that your warning and that report was taken seriously enough back in 2015?
Well, clearly not. But I think it did really give us some language to talk about the problem. And that has resonated, talking about the Palestine exception to free speech, I think has become very common. It is not the only exception, but it has become a primary way that our First Amendment rights are being eroded and destroyed. And we're seeing that replicated elsewhere. So I think it gave us a framework and a language to talk about what's happening. And, really starting to talk about this as a McCarthyist kind of effort to silence, a certain viewpoint. And now we're seeing that on an unprecedented level, perhaps worse than McCarthyism itself, right? So, yeah, I think certainly it wasn't taken as seriously in the halls of power, right? I will say, though, that pre-2023, we did feel like we were making inroads and progress in exposing this problem, really establishing the way that this was based on and was exacerbating anti-Palestinian racism and discrimination. And I think October 7th really shattered many things and created a hysteria and a rush to suppress advocacy and activism against the genocide. I think we're in a new era in a lot of ways. And that anti-Palestinian racism is the reason that this genocide is allowed to happen. Without it, we would not be able to abide by this many Palestinian deaths, turn a blind eye to this inhumane genocide. There's no question about that. This is so pervasive on every level of society that we can let this happen. So really what we're seeing today in terms of the suppression here is an extension of the genocide. It is how the genocide is enabled. But I will say that I don't think it's working. I think what the Trump administration is doing right now is an all-out assault. They don't care about the law. They don't care about the courts. They are bulldozing, as the Israelis do, everything in their path. But on the level of public opinion, it's not working. And in fact, I think that the tides are shifting globally on this issue. But what we're seeing is the consolidation of power. We are going to be facing a lot of trials, right?
Yeah.
In terms of really protecting our people, protecting our movements, and building towards something better, right? So it's going to be really, really hard, and it's going to take a lot of courage to challenge this wave of authoritarianism and fascism. But what I'm trying to say is that we have the numbers, we have the people who really believe in humanity, who believe in what is left of international law and the kind of notion that every human being deserves life and dignity.
What you're really saying, Dima, is Palestine will be free and we're going to win this thing. That's what you're really saying.
Inshallah, Palestine will be free. And it's not just Palestine, right? I mean, I think the same forces that are enabling the genocide, the occupation of Palestine, apartheid, are also enabling oppression around the globe and are also, the root of oppression here. Whether, we're talking about a nation built on genocide and slavery. And, the forces today are basically saying, oh, slavery was great. It's a white nationalist resurgence right now. So everything that has happened over the past decades to establish the notion that there should be equality, that is being challenged by right-wing forces everywhere that want inequality, that want racial hierarchy, right? That want the domination of capital and the consolidation of power.
So as you can tell, I'm trying to push the audience to the Pal Legal website. If you all get a chance, please read the Palestine Exception to Free Speech. It's a powerful report. And that's my segue, really, Dima. The repression hasn't slowed, as you mentioned. It's spiked sharply. I want to give some data, if that's okay. After October 7, 2023, 1,000 requests in just 3 months that Palestine Legal received, which was 4 times than that of 2022. In 2024, the number rose to over 2,000 requests. That's a 600% increase compared to 2022. And again, the majority of that came from students and faculty on campus. Is this escalation proof that what we are doing is actually working? The work that Palestine Legal is doing is working. ADC, all of us as a combined group, is it proof that it's working?
I think it's proof of the power of the movement and the threat that it poses to the status quo, to the orthodoxies of the bipartisan, right, a ruling class, really. There is almost no daylight between the two parties in this country around support for Israel. And we're starting to see cracks in that, of course. But I think it is proof of the power of the movement when we see this level of repression, this level of propaganda, this level of gaslighting, really, right? To the point where we are portrayed as, just monsters and only motivated by one thing, by racism, when it's our people who are being decimated, right? And there's a genocide happening. So yes, I think it's a sign of the power of the grassroots, the student movement. We have seen throughout history that it is youth, it is students who are at the forefront of all major movements that create transformative change. Whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the anti-apartheid movement against the South African apartheid regime, the abolitionist movement. And that's why I think the repression has always been focused on campuses, because that's where we see the most creative efforts to challenge the status quo, to push for divestment of these universities from companies that are fueling and enabling the violence, the genocide. In terms of the tactics, like I said, really none of them are new to us. Not the doxing, not the punishment of students for their speech activities, not the lawfare, but the kind of consolidation of those tactics, the exponential increase in the use of these tactics is definitely new. We saw doxing on unprecedented levels after October 7th against students, against employees in employment spaces. As I mentioned, the number of cases that we've seen against movement actors, frivolous cases, has spiked. One of the newer things that we're seeing is what the Trump administration is doing, defunding without any process universities allegedly based on their conclusion that these universities are enabling anti-Semitism, right? For other reasons as well, DEI, pro-trans policies, or what have you. And that is being challenged, but it is a tool that has really accelerated universities' complete capitulation to political pressure.
Yeah.
Where before, certainly we saw many a time politicians and donors and alumni pressuring universities into bad action against Palestinians and Palestine activists. Now it's the full weight of the federal government threatening existentially these universities by taking away hundreds of millions and billions in federal funding. And I think that is a major escalation that we've seen, a totally unconstitutional one. And Harvard recently won its lawsuit against the Trump administration. But, the reality is that most of the tactics that we're seeing, we've seen for many years, and it's the volume that is really unprecedented.
So what's your advice to students, to staff, and to teachers who are facing repression? Loaded question, I know.
Yeah. First of all, I think students are incredibly smart and courageous, and, they have everything it takes to stand up right now. I think it takes a lot of courage, right? The threats are real. We've seen so many who have borne the brunt of repression from their own universities, from the police brutality that their own universities have often unleashed against them, from criminal charges for protesting. And they still insist that they wouldn't do anything differently, that they know that they must continue because of what's at stake here, right? That it is a moral obligation to stand up and resist against not only the genocide, but what's happening here in the US. So I think that's the first thing. I think the courage is within each of us, and this is the time to really tap that courage against all the odds. And I know many students are willing to take the consequences that might come, but also there are many things that I think it's important for all of us who are speaking out, who are engaging, who are still organizing. There are many steps we can take to mitigate the impact of the repression, to mitigate the threats. And, that includes everything from taking digital security measures to really organizing to protect each other and to support each other, mutual aid kind of organizing. And I will also say, of course, that this is the reason Palestine Legal exists. This is what so many other legal organizations and lawyers are doing right now. We are here to have your back, and you're not alone, right? And I think that is a major element here that can help bolster our courage to keep going, that, whatever happens, you have people who are here to support you and defend you. And I think the other thing I'll say is that there might not always be legal avenues to win, to prevent the kind of repression we're seeing. It's really critical that any legal avenues are combined with organizing. The legal by itself isn't going to make the difference. And time again, certainly in Sadine's case and so many others that we've worked on, where there's organizing, where students are able to mobilize their own communities around them and build the pressure on the university and expose what's happening in the media, there are so many opportunities to shift what's happening and achieve results. And that organizing is part and parcel of our fundamental organizing against genocide, when we tie it back to what's happening and really stand firm about the why. Why are we organizing? Why are we speaking out? And that's what we have to continually insist on. This is a movement for freedom, for justice, despite the way that our opposition paints us. we have to stand firm in our moral and ethical motivations here. I think it's really critical to think about all the avenues. And certainly we're seeing a lot of victories in the courts. And I think it's important to consider those legal avenues. We recently won a lawsuit against the University of Maryland that tried to ban a student vigil last October 7th. And we won the case, we won the preliminary injunction, and the court said the university had to allow the students to hold the vigil. But we also then won a settlement on behalf of the students for $100,000. So it's really critical to fight for free speech rights in the courts and beyond. And there are many people doing that. There are many cases that are winding their way through the courts. A case was just won against the University of Pittsburgh for suspending an SJP chapter, again on First Amendment grounds. These cases don't often have immediate results. And as I said, the organizing around these cases is just as important as what happens in the court. And we have to insist on using the courts in ways that really uplift what the movement is trying to do. I want to just maybe say a little bit more about some of the measures that I think it's really important for student activists, but really everyone to be taking. One of the trends that we're seeing, and I'm sure many, many folks who are listening know, is just the massive increase in surveillance capabilities. That's the case on campuses as much as it is off campuses. There are things that we can do to protect our privacy, to protect our data. So I really encourage folks, we have a lot of resources on our website as well, PalestineLegal.org, to start taking those measures to increase your digital security, really think strategically about how you're communicating with your peers and your colleagues and your comrades. I think this is the time to really be strategic and careful about how we're organizing with the extreme crackdowns that are happening. And the other piece of it is knowing your rights. Yes, there is lawlessness. Yes, ICE doesn't care about your rights. Yes, we're seeing the kind of erosion every day of civil rights and liberties, but we still have those rights, and we are seeing courts upholding those rights. And so it's important to understand what you need to know if you find yourselves in encounters with law enforcement, whether that be FBI or ICE or local police or campus police, and other rights that you still have, First Amendment rights and otherwise. We have, again, a lot of resources on our website, and resources are out there. And please reach out if you want support. And we do Know Your Rights workshops, as do many other groups these days. So that is critical reinforcement right now, and thinking about ways to organize to best protect your rights. We also are available to consult if you are organizing something. What are the threats or risks that you should think about as you make decisions about your organizing? Again, reach out at PalestineLegal.org. We really need to be more intentional and strategic about the way that we organize in this environment.
So reach out if you need help from Palestine Legal, but also don't forget to support Palestine Legal. Maybe Dima won't say it, I'll say it for her. Donations are needed. Every dollar counts. So please do support. And Dima, just an offer for your team. If you want to do an episode that specifically talks about the workshop you mentioned, I'm happy to do an episode around that as well. So Dima, last question for you. And I know you don't like to make it about yourself here, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Invariably, there are young girls that are looking up to you. You're a powerful Palestinian woman leading a nonprofit organization. You're on the front lines defending our rights. What is your message to those young girls looking up to you?
What's my message? I guess, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of pressure. Often, I think we hold ourselves back because we think that we don't know what we're doing. And I'll just say that in my own experience, I have learned so much as I've gone, right? Like, I think we learn through experience. We don't have to know all the things, but we do have to be committed to learning and to growing. This is a moment to really let go of our inhibitions. I have many of those, right? And have had many of those and have had to overcome that and really, really recognize the role that we're playing in this moment. And many are looking to all of us as Palestinians and otherwise to lead by example and to model. So I think starting an organization and building an organization and now, protecting an organization and the work that we're doing, I never feel like, I know what's going to happen and I know all the answers, and that's okay. And part of the work is the relationships and building with others who are asking the same questions. And it's a collective effort and we're never alone in that. And I think, it's taken me a lot of time to learn some of those lessons.
Well, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Thanks, Ed, and I appreciate the podcast and the space that you're creating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.